Welcome back to Simple Truth, where we try to pull some simple truths out of the Bible. We're in the story of David. We're in 1 Samuel, been there for 2 years probably. The story of David in 1 Samuel. We're in chapter 26. We're going to start in verse 9. We finished with verse 8 last time. But here's what it says, starting in verse 9. But David said to Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" This is a super important verse, right? God's anointed is not necessarily a term for people who are godly, right? It is a term for people who are chosen. God's anointed means you are chosen for a time, for a purpose, for a plan, for a season, whatever it is, you're chosen by God. And David recognizes this. And whether or not he recognized the whole picture of it, what we can look back at it and see is that David was also God's anointed. God anointed through Samuel David to be the next king. And so the precedent that David is setting here is super important. Right? Like, hey, I'm also anointed. God doesn't want people to be able to touch his plan, his anointed, his purpose. Now, did that happen in the Bible? Did God's anointed suffer, die, do all of those things? Absolutely, Jesus, right, had that happen to him. But God's plan is for his anointed to do that which he has called them to do. Be very careful, whether that's in judgment and blessing, whether that's leading you through the Red Sea into the promised land, whether that's ruling over, being king, right? Whatever that calling is, God doesn't want people interfering with his plan, his purpose for his people. And that's important for you and I to put into practice today. Are you getting in the way of God's purpose and plan? As you rail against politicians and you rail against leaders in your church and rail against people at work and rail against your family, right? Your husband, your wife, whoever it is, as you're railing against people, might you be railing against those who have been chosen to lead you? It doesn't matter what you think about those people. It doesn't matter how you feel about those people. It does matter whether or not you can see godliness in them, but that also, right, isn't the final say in whether God will use them. God used a bunch of ungodly people for his purposes, for godly purposes. And they were anointed, they were chosen, they were set aside, they were announced way ahead of time. That I'm going to use this person to bring about the redemption of people. To build me a temple. I'm going to use this person to carry out judgment on people. We have to be careful. So as we're looking and reacting to the lack of godliness in someone, that's important. Being able to recognize whether somebody is godly or not is important. But disqualifying them from being used by God for his purpose and his plan for such time as this, that's not our place. So we need to remind each other, don't touch God's anointed. Be in touch with God so that you know what he might be using his anointed for. Chew on that. We'll see you next time right here. Simple Truth.